Welcome, those of you who are viewing, to LudoNarraCon 2023. We have the survival storytelling panel. As we all know, survival is a huge genre on Steam especially, and yet this is a storytelling festival about Ludo narrative topics. So we thought we would get together and talk with a few game designers about what it means to tell stories in a survival context. What are the challenges? What are the successes? What's interesting to us about that as game designers, as storytellers? Each of us has a little bit of a different perspective based on the games that we've made, the games that we enjoy, the rest of our lives. So let's go ahead and get to know each other a little bit. And I'm going to be the moderator. I'm Tanya X Short. I'm the lead of Kitfox Games, which is a small independent studio in Montreal. Previously, my heart belonged to MMOs, but since then we've made games like Boyfriend Dungeon. We've published Dwarf Fortress, which is arguably a survival storytelling game. I don't know, maybe we'll debate it later. And currently we have a bunch of secrets in development. So you can also check out our upcoming published game, 6 Ages 2, maybe David can go next, and Mossfield Origins.
Hi, I'm David Dunham. I am making, as Tanya alluded to, 6 Ages 2, the sequel to 6 Ages, which could even itself be considered a survival game. 6 Ages 2 basically is you surviving until the world ends. Raf?
Sorry, I didn't know I was next.
Sure, tag in the next person.
Sorry, yeah. So I'm Rafael Van Lerp. I'm the founder and creative director at Hinterland, based in Vancouver, mostly in Vancouver, although we're all over the place. And we're best known for our survival game, The Long Dark, and working on other fun secret things besides that. Go ahead, Giada.
Hello, my name is Giada Zavarese. I currently work as a content designer at Paradox on Stellaris, and previously I worked as a freelance narrative designer. I work on my own game, Sun in Sunlight. I work on games like Monster Loves You 2, which will soon be released by Japan Games, and other stuff. Who is next?
Oh, that'd be me, I think. Hello, I'm Julian Quijano. I'm a creative director at Beautiful Glitch. We are the creators of the franchise Monster Prom, which is multiplayer narrative adventures with 18 scene mechanics. But the third installment, Monster Prom 3, Monster Road Trip, actually has a lot of survival mechanics. Less of a dating scene, more of a multiplayer survival adventure.
So, I mean, maybe that's a good place to start. I don't know if someone wants to jump in, but I started wondering about survival storytelling because it feels like the stakes are already so high. When you're about to die anyway, like how do you make people care about any kind of story if they're already thinking about resources and maximizing longevity or things like that? I don't know if that's something that comes up in Monster Prom, but it definitely felt like something you must have struggled with on The Long Dark.
You want to go ahead, Julian?
Me first. Oh, okay. Yeah, it's true that when I think of this, is the sense that the franchise Monster Prom is a comedic franchise, and thus the stakes feels probably lower than most survival games. But this point is really interesting and relevant because even if I say like this installment has had maybe the most positive, English is my second language, reception from all the games, we have seen a few players that complain maybe or criticize that sometimes they get the fantasy broken because they go into crunching the numbers, which I think is the main issue, no matter if you are a super grim or comedic survival game, is how you avoid the players. The main mechanic is managing resources and trying, well, not to die, right? But you need to this challenge always of, okay, how you keep the player doing this without making it a numbers game, right? And I think it's all down to narrative. Even if the game is not mostly narrative, you need to infuse some narrative so the player can get into the vibe, into the fantasy. Otherwise, they could be as well playing a numbers game in a newspaper, which is a fun game too. but it may break the fantasy. So for us, it's all about really catering to the fantasy, this very intimate fantasy sometimes, which is very normal in survival stories, right? Like just now we had like Last of Us with the TV show and all, of course, the games too. And I think it's always about these little interactions. You need the player to be in this sort of zoom in sometimes, right? So they can forget for a time that they are just crunching numbers not to die. That's my opinion, at least.
Yeah, I mean, for us in the Long Dark, first of all, it's a great question. It's a really interesting topic, and probably talk for hours about it. I think in the Long Dark we have a couple different ways we approach that or consider that, and it depends on whether you're looking at our story mode, Wintermute, or whether you're looking at our survival mode, which is very much a systems-driven sandbox without like any real formal narrative per se, except for what's in the world. And I think you mentioned the stakes. I think for us, because in our survival mode, it's permadeath, the stakes, the fact that you might die and lose all your progress, for example, is what makes all your decisions feel like they have relevance and that they matter, gives some weight to them. And I think that it's very interesting, I think, with our player community, because people do love Wintermute, they do love the authored story, and that's where we we introduce characters, and that's really where we're building up the IP of the Long Dark and explaining to people kind of what the world is and involving them in a story that we've written. But of course, players are mostly engaged in their own story. And I think partly the answer here comes down to how you define storytelling or what a story is, because I think what I've seen is for most players, the survival mechanics are the story. The resource management becomes the story. It's all the little decisions that you make every day in the game to figure out how you're going to survive a little bit longer, and all the unexpected events that happen because of the interrelationship between all the different systems that creates all these moments of serendipity or these moments of disaster that then become your story about how you survived for those days. So death is really just the thing that enhances the experience and makes those little choices feel like they have meaning. There are stakes, there's something to lose, which means that every little thing that leads up to that has some importance to the player. And because it has importance and all those little choices matter, and they're choices that I made, that becomes my story of survival. And I would contrast that actually with most genres, and particularly the very cinematic shooters, like, you mentioned Last of Us as an example. Like there's very little player story in Last of Us. There's combat encounters, there's maybe some different choices that I make about how I choose to fight through situations. But other than that, the story is essentially the same no matter what I do, no matter how many times I play it. I might be very engaged because the acting is great and the presentation is really strong, but there's no authorship for the player in that experience. Therefore, it's not a, the lack of sort of survival mechanics in that context to me takes away some of the value that I put into it as a player, and therefore I don't feel like it's my story at all.
Yeah, David, so 6 Ages 2 has what seems to be a stronger survival or danger element to it than the first 6 Ages or its predecessor, King of Dragon Pass. Have you had any playtest, experiences that pointed to whether that had added to the drama or the player stories had changed in nature because of the added, lethality?
Yeah. Actually, one of the issues in 6 Ages is, and King of Dragon Pass to some extent too, they kind of subvert one of their genres. Because if you look at them, they're narrative games, but they're also strategy games. And people usually think of strategy as 4X and you expand. And even in the first 6 Ages game, you're not really expanding. You are kind of surviving and figuring out a way out of your conundrum of stronger neighbors. And 6 Ages 2 is like, we're trying to be really explicit. You can't survive really in a way, but you still have to try. So it's even more of a subversion of, still has the trappings of a strategy game. You're still managing your cows and you're still have raising warriors and that's all there still, but you're also, the games also are trying to, I don't know if raising the stakes is quite right, but you have the characters that are your playing pieces, and they have their own personalities, they have their own stories, and those can really, your clan may survive, but if you lose one of your favorite little heroes, it still hurts.
I feel like that's part of the brilliance of some Paradox games too, is the idea of people as resources and unconventional approaches to what is a resource in your personal story. But maybe you wanted to talk about something else, Giada. Feel free to chime in. Everybody feel free to chime in at any time on anything. We can be pretty spontaneous about the
Something I found interesting is so far we talk about the survival mechanics applied to basically visual novels, and somebody mentioned shooter games, and now we switch to strategy game, because I think that one of the questions here is, like, I don't want to be pedantic, but what is a survival game? Because last week I was like checking on Steam what are the top games with a survival tag, because I'm like, oh, maybe I missed something cool, I need to prepare for this panel. And the top game most relevant to the survival was Apex Legend, which is a battle royale. And the second one is PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds. And then you get a bunch of games like Rust and Arcs, or some game with like Factorio has a survival tag. So I think it would be interesting to define what survival means, because I think it's a case where like the player perception is a bit different from the developer's perception. As in,
I mean, for the purposes of this panel, I don't think we need to worry about it too much. It's more about how we as designers approach this question of storytelling that have survival elements in it. Maybe some players will come to the panel expecting us to talk only about Rust, and then they'll wander away disappointed. But sorry for those of you, well, they're probably already gone by this point, let's be honest. If they came to the panel hoping for that, they're lost. So those of you who are still sticking around, thank you, welcome. We're gonna keep on talking storytelling across genre, basically, because to me, I think what's interesting about game design is the user experience. It's what is the player experiencing, what are the choices they're making, what are the emotions they're feeling, and why, and how do we co-author this experience with them, for them. And so like within that constraint, like we could talk about game design obviously the rest of our lives, but for this particular, looks like we have 30 minutes left. Just talking about where that intersects with themes of trying to survive, and also within like a narrative design context. But yeah, I don't know, those particular games might not have been inspiring to you, Giada, but have you had other design experiences that maybe contributed to what we've been talking about?
No, I actually think that it's interesting that so many different games with so many different genres are tagged as survival games, because I think that they all represent surviving, but in different ways, because there are games like Apex Legends or Rust, where mostly it's you fighting to survive in a hostile environment full of enemies who want to kill you. And there's sometimes other players, sometimes monsters. So it's like you against fighting for your survival. Whereas the other games where we talk that are more about the strategy, more like Factorio or Six Ages, are more about your the struggle is about having a limited number of resources and having to manage that to make sure that you can take care of yourself.
And like Monster Loves You, you can also lose, right? Like if you mismanage your resources, is that true, or is that not?
I work on it like before the pandemic, so I don't know if I made it like decided to revamp it and change all the mechanics. But when I work on it, it has similar to Monster Loves You 1, as in you have different resources because you're a monster and you're trying to survive in this world of monsters. And sometimes maybe you can survive, but for people who have not played the original Monster Loves You, is a branching visual novel where you're a tiny monster who is just growing up and making their story in a monster society. So the sequel has a similar structure, and sometimes you simply have choices that are denied to you because you don't have enough resources. Maybe you want to talk to this monster like a civilized monster, but you don't have enough patience, so you just lash out instead. So it's not just about survival, but about like, can I be the best version of myself?
I would probably argue just that it's a bit dangerous for us to lean on like player tags on Steam to drive academic discussions about genre, because like, you know, for a long time, Long Dark had multiplayer as a tag on Steam, and it's like the least multiplayer game ever made. So
was that them trying to pressure, like the Steam base trying to pressure you? How did that happen?
I think people just, I don't think people give that much thought to the like the tagging system. I don't think necessarily, and you can go in and edit it yourself as a developer, of course. And but I guess the thing that's interesting is I think is that yes, it is true that survival. So first of all, survival is finding its way into a lot of different genres. Like when it became really popular, 8 years ago, you started to see like, oh, now Fallout's going to have a survival mode, and like all these big AAA franchises started implementing sort of their versions of a survival mode because it was popular. Just like 10 years before that, everybody started to have an RPG and progression was in everything, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think some of these things are trends that just follow what's popular. I thought David's comment about strategy mechanics is very relevant. I've always thought about the Long Dark as a strategy game before, I worked on RTSs early in my career, and a lot of the framework of a survival game, at least an open world one, I think is really drawing from, the RTS design, because it's all about economy and resources and managing time. Trying to bring it back to storytelling, because I think that's sort of what we're here for. I think, the original question that you asked, Tanya, like one thing to me that's interesting about at least the genre of survival games that I'm working in and always thinking about, which is by no means the right one or whatever, but it's just where my head is always at, is this tension between that exists in every open world game, which is like open world games are about exploration and discovery and letting players kind of be freeform and do what they want instead of being in these like linear kind of on rails experiences. But that like the rules of traditional storytelling really are all about like being able to control pacing and drive and have a plot and give motivations for characters, and that's something, again, like not to pick on Last of Us, but like it's perfectly designed as a game to follow that more traditional structure, which is why I think it works so well also as a TV series. But like most open world games really don't, and we've all played the Skyrims and the Fallouts and the big open world games and had that experience too of like, well, character X really needs me to do something super urgently, and we do this in the Long Dark too, right? In our story mode, I really need to go do this thing super urgently, and yet I also can wander off and harvest, rose hips for a week if I want to in between, and then I'm going to come back and it's still going to be super urgent for me to do that task. So there's a really interesting kind of tension to me, and what a story needs to be interesting and successful, and what a survival game, or probably any open world game, needs to be interesting and successful. And I don't know that anybody's really quite figured that one out yet, but I think it does say something fundamental about what a survival game is.
Yeah, there's an interesting transformation that happened with Dwarf Fortress as well, where it was originally envisioned by Tarn and Zach as an RPG, an adventure of one single entity in a generated world. And then, as soon as they made a more like God view of lots of little dwarves doing their thing, like that, the Fortress mode became what was seen as the default mode. And currently that's the only mode on Steam. And they're working towards adventure mode in the future. But it was definitely one of those moments where it felt like, looking at it now, we can see like, okay, settlement type, colony management type sims are very popular in their way. But that story is so much harder to tell. Like it's a story about a community, which I know games like Frostpunk have really, taken that to the maximum. And like how does a group of people survive in a hostile environment? But I would have imagined that the adventure mode would have been more popular, because it seems so much more relatable, so much more like you can tell an I did this and this happened kind of story. And maybe we'll see once it has graphics that'll be different. But historically, back when people just had their imaginations to work with, for whatever reason, the community was more effective as a storytelling mechanism between the players than the avatar-based I did this kind of story. And that's still a question mark to me about like, why is that? What is it about either the gameplay of Dwarf Fortress or the types of stories people want to put on forums, or I don't know exactly what was going on there, but I don't know if anybody else has thoughts about community stories versus personal stories.
That's sort of what King of Dragon Pass and 6 Ages are. So you're telling the story of a clan, and yes, you have people in it and they're important, but it's really the success, or can your clan survive is always the real question.
Yeah, I feel like the standout moments to me when I'm playing Six Ages are when my heroes do go on their own little adventure, though. Like when we go to the other world and have our, like, we're trying to reenact a legend, which Dwarf Fortress doesn't have that. It doesn't have the ability for, like, okay, now I'm going to embody one of these dwarves and we're going to go on a special quest. Maybe that's something I could suggest to Tarn someday, but I'm sure he has his own plans. But yeah, I don't know if you've had thoughts, David, about the different ways that the community can like grow towards different stories, because it, like, right now we've only talked about like survive or die, and there's obviously other outcomes that are possible.
Yeah, I don't know, some of my notes were talking about how in Six Ages 2 especially, we're showing survival because your peers are dying, the other clans are starting to die too, and that kind of shows, you know, what's in store for you if you don't do it right. And the breakdown of society in general. It's not, we're trying to show the world is ending is a pretty loose term, and like, why is it ending? Is it because like kids don't listen to their parents anymore, like the Romans used to complain about, or was it the Greeks?
The loud music, yeah.
You know, or is it because volcanoes are erupting and destroying? You know, there's lots of ways the world can end, and there's a lot of narrative scope there.
I think that like narrative can be used very well for this kind of, okay, I need a justification for how some mechanics are creating tension. As in, I don't know if you ever played a survival game called Miasmata. Miasmata was basically a proto Dead Stranding, as in one of the first games I ever remember playing, when you're walking in a place and like if you run too much on a steep surface, you will just tumble and fall. And the story behind Miasmata is that you're a sick person and you're in an island looking for some herbs for a cure. And there is a monster roaming the island, and the monster can appear at every second, every time. And also you're sick because of this. So it had a very nice balance between, okay, I need the medication, so I need to go around and pick some herbs, or I'm just going to die. But also if I go, I just wander and get lost, the monster might just kill me. So it provides just a nice narrative theme on why all this is happening.
We're going pretty far off script, but does anybody have any thoughts of yeah, these mechanisms to either remind the player about the narrative or the survival aspects, or ways that maybe both at once? I don't know. If Julian, it looked like you had a comment about.
Oh yeah, but it was on the other notion that
Sure,
we were discussing, yeah, about the community idea, and I have a couple of thoughts. First, I think when thinking why the community stories tend to be sometimes more popular than the ones that one person under duress. First, I think because lately stories that has a roster of characters tend to be more popular. This is a very broad answer, but I think this is true. Like, we are moving from a superhero movie to a Marvel cinematic universe, from a TV show about one person to a Game of Thrones with houses and whatnot. And my notion is that a lot of audience want these sort of narratives that feels like with a community or a roster, I can like relate to one of these characters. It's almost like the story version of doing a pop quiz, right? Like, which character are you? It seems simplistic, but I think there's a lot of that. And I think also, like, and it sort of links to the other topic we were discussing of what's a survival story, right? Which is, I guess, a story or a game where there's a scarcity of resources and you have to do increasingly hard choices, right? Even when we go to all the games that is not survival games, but games with a survival mode, the survival mode is when you cannot like heal or have multiple lives. Is the one like there's basically scarcity. Is like, okay, how long you survive, right? And it sort of enhances the strategy through hard choices, which links very well when you are doing the storytelling of it. And so my point here is that when we get into the fantasies that are also increasingly popular of society collapsing, because there's, I think, an increasing notion, skepticism about society and how durable or sustainable
For
it is.
some reason, nobody knows why,
Yeah,
but you know.
yeah, exactly. So narratives that sort of ask the question, okay, so now we are getting to the idea that at some point it will collapse. So what happens next? Since it goes from this notion of society collapse, then it's more, I guess, popular to think of narratives that think of what comes next from a society, from a community perspective, right? It's less the Robinson Crusoe and more the Lord of the Flies, right? Okay, how this group under duress can reveal a system that maybe is better than the one we have and can like endure, which is not what happened again. I mean, our game is a road trip and how you survive to that. But responding to, because it happens to me too, I prefer when I say like a survival story, I like the one with 15 characters, 10 characters trying to okay, how we interact from now on this very specific setting. And I think these are some reasons why community-based survival stories tend to be more popular than the classic, castaway sort of story. Of course, there's everything for all kind of tastes, sure, but maybe this is why these are more popular, I think.
Yeah, we're talking about community in a couple different ways here too, which is interesting. You're talking about community survival in the sense of and David as well, like a community of characters within a survival game that are collectively trying to survive through a situation. And there's also the notion of community storytelling or community survival, which is where the story is created by the players, not the developer necessarily, which is the example that I was trying to give between sort of our story mode and survival mode, where the community has a stronger feeling about their story of survival than the one necessarily where they're playing another character, like a character that we've created for them. And I think it's interesting to me because it's almost exactly the opposite of what you said, because I think in that sense, it's more about the individual feeling that sense of vulnerability and where all those decisions that they have to make to survive day to day sort of add up, and the loss of them because of death feels so much more personal, more so than if it was spread across other characters, or to your point, Tanya, the idea of like a perspective. So like having a, I always find for myself that the survival games that are third-person games are not nearly as compelling because I don't have that same sense of immersiveness within the character, and that it's happening to me, and I can kind of lose myself in that adventure and feel that whatever is happening to my survivor is happening to me, and I have that really strong personal connection to it. But yes, it's interesting how community can mean so many different things.
Yeah, I mean, we could differentiate those two very different concepts if we wanted to say, like, for the rest of this panel, let's say it's like player-to-player story versus in-game community or something like that. But
right.
I don't know how much further we're going to get into that necessarily. I don't know if anybody wants to chime in with. We've mentioned a couple of different games that we've enjoyed or admired. Does anybody have any other survival stories in games that they've really found something interesting?
See if I can, I should mention like a sort of, I'd say, classic indie game that's also Spanish, could be Gods Will Be Watching, right? Which it's a very narrative heavy survival game that poses 4 or 5 situations where survivability is approached in very different ways. And we played it here at the office actually, and I had a great time. And what's interesting, and I think is relevant to this panel, is that at times the mechanics weren't like to us like amazing in terms of survivability, but we didn't care that much about that because they care very well for the vibe of it. There's like the most popular scene, which is in the trailers, is like you are in a campfire because you are in a planet, stranded out is the word, and you are like make choices that are hard, again, in this group of 5-6 people, because the resources can affect to one or the other. Do you use like energy to, I don't know, to repair a radio or to care for your robot friend? And it enhances the hard choices. And I think it's a game that's really, really interesting, really worth to play. And it goes to show that even if it doesn't have like very convoluted mechanics in a way, if you manage to get like the vibes right, so suddenly it feels like the experience getting small in a good way, in the way that, okay, I'm forgetting that I'm here in the office and I'm like I'm in this campfire. surviving. And I think that's something so important, again, for all the games, but in survival games it's so important because it really gets you invested, and then the stakes feel way more real just by the sheer power of narrative, but not how cheesy that may sound. I wanted to mention that again. I think it's a good one.
I think something interesting about survival games that are about a group is that if you look at other mediums, like if you work as zombie movies, like when there is a group, the story tends to be focused about conflict within the group. Like the moment somebody gets bitten by a zombie, then the groups fall apart and people start shooting each other. Whereas games tends to be more about the group surviving together, and there is less of this kind of friction usually. Like I'm thinking about David games, about Kings of Dragon Pass. You start with a single band and then you get a tribe and people just start working together. And it's probably because you're a player as the group, and just having people just in your group just bickering would be frustrating as the player. But I think it's interesting because it's the same kind of stories, but just with completely different twists because of the medium.
I mean, I think that there's a good amount of conflict. Correct me if I'm wrong, David, but it feels like they don't kill each other very often. Like there's a couple of scenes maybe, but mostly they bicker a lot, which is very endearing.
You sort of get to pick who the bickering people are when you form a tribe. You know, at least it's foreshadowed that these two clans are probably not going to be happy together, but you got to pick them, so you live with your decision.
But that's my favorite thing about 6 Ages is mousing over the different characters' faces and they're like yelling at each other. That's like the best moment.
Again, you pick them.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's true, if they were going to kill each other, maybe I'd feel more guilty about mousing over them. I'd be like, no, I don't want to see the inter-tribe murder. I don't know. I was going to say that speaking of inter-clan murder, I actually, I'm not claiming that this is my favorite because I am attached to it. I'm biased. I was only a writer. I was not a designer. Our first published game at KitFox in 2017 was The Shrouded Isle. Which it was pretty soon after Gods Will Be Watching, actually. And I think it might have been somewhat influenced, if I recall correctly. But it was also somewhat influenced by 6 Ages because it has these procedurally generated villagers. And what I admired about it as a designer, again, it wasn't my design, was that it felt like you were getting to know them as they were approaching death. Like there was this feeling of not even sure what loss aversion you were going to have, and because you have to sacrifice someone every season in that game. Like you have to please the gods, you have to pick somebody to die, and if you know them well enough, you can choose whether it's good for the group or not. But sometimes you just have to roll a dice and say, well, I'm killing someone randomly because I don't know any of you very well, and that's like a very dangerous choice, but it's early in the game. And I thought it was really interesting because like you were saying, Julian, as it gets smaller and smaller, it sort of naturally increases the pressure dramatically, because instead of having these loose connections between 20 people, now it's like 4 people you know really well, and you have to choose what's going to happen with them now that they're like fully realized characters to you. And I felt like that was a very elegant like dovetail of the gameplay and the narrative, that it was like increasing tension and just natural drama that way.
Yeah, which is to say, like, now that I think of it, one good thing about the survival games where you sort of play with a community is that obviously the characters you can grow attached to are well expendable, right? Which if it's only one person, I guess the most obvious design that comes to mind is if you die, you die. Like again, talking about Gods Will Be Watching, like suddenly the characters are quite tied to the resources. You are like, oh, okay, this one is like sort of, and it's very cool to say like this way, but high maintenance, or even like this one is not very useful. This happens like you have a dog and the dog is not very useful. And we were discussing, like I was
but
like,
who's going to kill the dog? Nobody.
Yeah, exactly. And you were like, we need to keep giving meat to the dog. And someone more practical was like, yeah, but the dog is, if we are listing, is the least useful. So yeah, but we need to give the meat to the dog. And that's very interesting, right? Because suddenly you know that technically as you are playing, and I guess that depends on what kind of player you are, is like you need to admit at least that the design allows you to okay, if one of the characters dies, the game continues.
Oh my God, I'm sorry that I'm going to share a second one, but I am recently fascinated by Road Warden, which isn't quite a survival game, but it has very strong post-survival elements.
I really want to play that one, yeah.
Sorry, what'd you say, Giada?
Just that it's very good.
Yeah. Anybody here is interested in narrative, like the atmosphere of survival. I feel like Road Warden does it really well. And I think that it does something. So the other thing I was going to say about the Shrouded Isle, like smaller, is that it also gets faster that way, right? Like there's just fewer and fewer elements. You're getting more and more stressed, but then it's over. Like it's the pacing matches very well. And I think Road Warden does that really well too. Where the days start getting shorter over the course of the game because it's timed to be summer, and then as fall approaches, like the sun sets earlier and earlier, so you need to go sleep earlier and earlier. You just have less and less to do every day, and I felt like that was a very elegant way too to sort of signal like you're running out of time, like you're literally running out. Your turns are shorter, but also the game end is like coming up towards you like a wall, and that was really a good feeling, a good bad feeling. Raf, did you have any comments about games you've been intrigued by, or other mediums? You know, whatever.
I mean, there are many, but I did want to give a shout out to one recently, just because it's quite different from the ones that we've been discussing. Is Floodlands, and it's essentially an RTS really. But what to me is what's interesting about it is that you can see that it shares some similarity with Frostpunk mechanically, but like the tone of it is really more. It's a post-apocalyptic setting, but it's the remnants of society trying to figure out like how they're going to continue. But there's like some hopefulness in it. It's not, dark and depressing like a lot of these post-apocalyptic settings can be, which frankly is the way I usually prefer them. But in this case, there's something nice about it, and I feel like we're heading towards a little bit of an intersection. Like I haven't played Terra Nil, but the sense of like looking at it is it's almost like strategy plus post-apocalyptic survival plus cozy game, like kind of all mashed together. And I just think it's interesting to see how people are using the survival genre as a way to explore some hopeful ideas and some positive ideas about the future, not just like how can I survive in yet another kind of Mad Max type setting. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Floodlands. I really enjoyed it, and I thought it was just refreshing to see something that was really, it felt like the creators were really trying to tackle some tough questions about environmentalism and just the world that we're living in right now, and the direction that we're heading in as a planet. And so I just wanted to mention that one. I thought that might be interesting for the viewers.
There's a science fiction author who's quite successful now called Becky Chambers, but she has a duology out at the moment that fairly recently. The first one was called Psalm for the Wild Built, and the second one it's the Monk and Robot series, but it's like the most explicitly like super utopian, like far post-apocalypse type fiction that I've read, and it's almost jarring how like deeply she situates her vision of like if we were to remove all of the toxic elements of our systems and make it a truly sustainable world, but it's also 1,000 years in the future, like what would that be? And I don't know if I agree with all of her underlying statements that she has to say. I think human nature is a little darker than she does, but it was still really interesting. Like I felt like, I don't know if you read or saw Station 11.
Yeah, which I love.
That was very dark in many ways, but also in some ways it was so hopeful that like, oh, the planet is doing great actually. Like, I think like at least the wilderness survived us, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think when Station 11 first came out, which is probably about 10, like the book came out 10 years ago, or roughly, I would say.
No, it was 2019 because I got it early pandemic and it was still like less than a year old. It was
We'll have to double check. I recollect picking it up in an airport in Seattle airport in a bookstore.
Maybe confusing it with Severance, the book, actually. So sorry. Anyway, continue. It doesn't matter. So please go ahead.
Yes, I recall it being earlier, but it doesn't really, like, the reason I bring it up is because I do think it felt fresh within the genre of post-apocalyptic fiction, because it wasn't about, yes, it's it's premised by like yet another sort of all too familiar to us global pandemic, but it's really the heart of the story is about, you know, theater and storytelling and how do people embrace art and culture to try to survive together as a community and try to hold on to the good things that we used to have. And it's not about, you know, trying to restore technology necessarily or any of the usual tropes. It was really about that. And yes, I just have to shout out the TV series. I feel like, I know everybody was talking about Last of Us on HBO, but I just think the Station 11 was also on HBO and around the same time. And it was just, I found it to have such an impact. Like I just can't remember another TV show that I've watched that I was so like just affected by. And if you haven't seen it, I recommend checking it out, especially if you're a fan of post-apocalyptic, but even just anything. The storytelling is so great. And the book also, the author being a Canadian, we kind of have to shout out for her as well. Emily St. John Mandel. Yeah, she's from the island actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the BC wilderness makes a pretty thorough appearance in the book. I don't think I think they change a lot of the details and some of the events in the show, but
well, Station 11, yeah, the book takes place in most of it, the beginning takes place in Toronto actually, and then it goes and they moved it to Chicago for the show. But her other novels are set, like she did Glass Hotel, which is on Vancouver Island, and her newest one, Sea of Tranquility, also touches on anyways, it's a bit of a sidetrack, but Floodlands, definitely check it out. And it is nice to see a little bit of just, you know, you can see people just working through different ideas, different feelings, different needs right now, and using the, you know, not just the mechanics of survival or strategy, but, you know, trying to bring some color, bring some life, bring some important philosophical questions. And I just appreciate a game that tries to do that. And I think they do it quite well.
I wanted to, if I can, to mention outside of games, since we are also talking other media, a couple of considerations. These are like not necessarily my favorite, but to think when I think of a genre, I think, okay, well, what are the conventions, which are not bad at all, but what are the things that are being done outside of that, right? When I think of survival games or stories, normally it goes to the grim, right? It makes sense, and it makes for great stories when it goes to that. And so there's two deviations I think they're interesting. One, of course, is when we go to other tones, as the one we explore ourselves, which is comedy. And I was thinking, okay, what other survival stories are essentially comedies? And one that comes to mind, obviously, is like Swiss Army Man, for instance. That's Swiss Army Man, I think is the name. The previous movie from the Daniels, right? Yeah. The one with the Daniel Radcliffe as a farting corpse, which is essentially a survival story through the lens of comedy. At the end, there's some twists, but basically, or I don't know, like movies like This Is the End. And I think it's interesting to see people daring to think, okay, how do we keep the stakes of a survival story, but still look into the absurd of it, into the mundane of it, right? I guess Zombieland in a way, right, would be like the zombie survival story through a bit of comedy. That's one deviation I love seeing fictions to explore. And the other one is like, normally when we think of survival stories, we think of apocalyptic situations, collapse of society, as I said, and something that's a subgenre that's a bit a subgenre of survival stories, a bit a subgenre of other genres. It depends, is what's called I think it's ontological mystery is the name, which is those settings where a character sort of wakes up and it's in a very weird setting with strange rules they need to learn on the go, and even the audience sort of are learning it on the go. It's a bit of a puzzle, a bit of a survival. It's, I guess, the classic movie everyone knows, and it's okay, like this type of movie will be like something like Cube, for instance, which is survival story, or movies like Circle, which is really interesting to watch, or The Platform, right, which is a Spanish movie, if I recall correctly. And it's very interesting because even if there are movies, it still feels like a game, because part of the plot is, okay, the character is learning the rules of this setting, like very weird rules. I, as the audience, are learning them. And it really invites the audience to do something that's very powerful in survival stories, which is, would I survive this? What I would do on this situation, something that happens a lot in survival stories. And when these sorts of very different subgenre invites you to, okay, I'm learning, okay, there's this rule and that thing. And would I play better this game, even if it's a movie, than the main characters? And I think it's a very interesting sort of a story that we normally don't think of when we think, okay, what's a survival story? And it's good to keep it in mind if you're like doing a survival story, like, okay, there's this, which is great, but there's these other things. And I think the name is ontological mystery. We researched it for some game ideas in the past, and it depends who you ask or where you search, but I think this is a term.
Yeah, so we're actually heading towards, I know I saw your hand, Giada, but we're heading towards the end of our time. We only have a few minutes left. So maybe starting with Giada, we could each take a minute to sort of any last things you want to talk about that you're interested in or hopes for survival stories in the future. It'd just be good to say like what's going to be up with you in the future, maybe as we sign off. Anybody?
I wanted to do as strong as to sidetrack and get back into the book you were talking before, but we don't have the time. So I just want to say that my hope for the future is to see less crafting in survival games, or at least a way to just put it together better with the story, because I think that crafting is a bit of a wasted opportunity, as in like the idea of, oh, I get a stick and then a rock and then creating something and then I'm getting better and better and doing that is something that, like, the act of creation in itself, it's beautiful, and we should just not put in a, oh, you found a rock, you found a claim, you click a button, duh. It's like a stronger part of the survival mechanically, and we don't use it in stories enough. That's it.
David, any thoughts?
I guess, I don't know if it's quite a thought. Some of what Tanya was talking about, how better use of sort of mechanics, like reducing your scope at the end of the game is it's fairly rare. I mean, there's some games where you get wounded and things get red around the edge or something. I guess that's a survival mechanic in a way, but we sort of that more explicitly getting the game to reinforce what's going on. I don't think we really did it much in 6 Ages 2, but the fact that if you compare the user interface of the second game, it's like it's all corroded. It kind of shows you that things are heading in a bad way. And I mean, that one's a pretty minor one. I can't take away too much of the interface because players would hate it if things stop working entirely, but
that'd be amazing. The buttons start fragmenting and yeah. 6 Ages 2 coming this year. Personally, my fixation lately, which this is a slight NDA breach, but our next big game is really looking at what it is to simulate a life. So like, what if you had an avatar in a fully simulated world, like, and at first maybe you have to survive, but that's, to me, like, that's not what's most interesting about my life, is where I'm getting my food exactly, or where I'm sleeping. But like, what am I doing with my life? Where am I deciding to spend my time, and how am I deciding to spend my days, and who do I end up wanting to use these? Because none of us are going to survive, right? Like, that's life as we know it. And so in a way, any story with like an end someday is a survival story, because it is a question of like time as the most limited resource. And so I'm really interested in deeper life simulations. I guess that's what I'm hoping will spark some really interesting player-to-player stories in the future. But Raf, you want to sign us off?
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
or actually, Julian. Sorry, Julian hasn't
yeah,
had a last comment
ahead,
either. So
Sorry, that's my cue. Yeah, no, I blubber a lot just before we went to this, and I said most of my ideas. I guess a final thought that's very far from what I used to. So this is as a more audience and developer, but as multiplayer games are more and more popular, many like MMORPGs, but also like an Among Us, right? When you are seeing, like, because multiplayer games are great for streamers and whatnot, I would love if we can see, because when we look at MMORPGs, you see like sorts of mechanics that go through progression and personal stuff. If it's the multiplayer aspect is more like guilds, and I want to see more interesting social mechanics that sort of go into what we were discussing about survival. Like, what if 20 people and there's hard choices, you know, and there's like permadeath. And I don't know, that sounds like really great content for streamers to play. I want to see that multiplayer experiences that really think of this scarcity, these hard choices, these moral decisions which are so popular, but towards other players where there's actual conflict. I would love to see that.
We're working on a bunch of stuff, you know, and not all of it is survival, but I think that obviously, you know, almost 10 years of working on the Long Dark there have been many opportunities to look at different parts of the survival experience, whether it's on the mechanics or the narrative level, and try to understand how to improve it. And I think there, you know, to Giada's point, I think there's a lot of tropes right now, mechanically and otherwise in survival, that are pretty stale. And I think it's really time to bring some innovation to the genre, at least from the point of view that I'm looking at it from, which is maybe a bit different. On the narrative side, I feel like our constant struggle is that tension between, you know, trying to engage players in that, so with some of the more traditional tools of storytelling that everybody's really familiar with, but also, you know, remaining very much gameplay driven. And, you know, I think we have learned some lessons on the Long Dark that we will apply to future projects and try to keep sort of pushing that forward as much as we can in our own way to ensure that, from our point of view at least, that you know, games really are, to me, the ascendant entertainment medium. You know, we're moving away from dependency on you know, the comic books and the cinematic universes and whatnot, and we can see what's happening kind of in pop culture right now. And I think we want to be there at the center of it and make sure that our medium, the one in which we all work in, is really driving sort of the next generation of all these different experiences and the IP that's being built around it. And then you know, our kids and our kids are playing, you know, the franchises that we build, just like we're watching the Super Mario Brothers movie to play, you know, watching the Dungeons and Dragons movie and things like that. So that's a little bit sort of where my head's at, but on the mechanics side, there's a million different places that I think we can really improve and innovate, and getting away from sort of the traditional survival craft multiplayer stuff, which has dominated the larger survival games for a long time. I think it's really time we get out of that and try to do something fresh.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about tabletop RPGs. Oh, that could take a whole nother hour. But that's all right.
Next call,
yeah. Well, thank you everybody for watching, and have a great LudoNarraCon. Bye.